Good evening, everyone. My name is Kelly Slippy, and on behalf of the Lancaster Conservancy, welcome to Nature Hour. Lancaster Conservancy's mission is to provide wild and forested lands and clean waterways for our community forever. We protect the ancestral lands of the Susquehannock, the Conestoga, and Shanks Ferry peoples, and I hope we care for these lands as well as these indigenous peoples. For 50 years, our organization has sought out natural places that are so precious and beautiful that they must be protected. Our stewardship team works to restore these special places by creating trails and planting trees. These preserves are then opened for you and I to use to hike, hunt, fish, and birdwatch 365 days a year. Places like Shanks Ferry, House Rock, Kelly's Run, Otter Creek, Climbers Run, Welsh Mountain, and many others are protected forever. We launched Nature Hour with the goal of bringing an assortment of local and regional experts directly to your home with presentations that help us better understand the Conservancy's work and the work of our community partners. The format of tonight's lecture will be a 40 to 45-minute presentation with 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A. If you have questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we will include these questions as part of the conversation. This is the last lecture of our 2024-2025 Nature Hour series. You can check out our YouTube channel for recordings of past Nature Hour lectures. As spring approaches, we would love to have you join us in person for some of our engagement events, including our upcoming spring wildflower walks and preserve explorations. You can learn more and register for these events on our website, lancasterconservancy.org, under upcoming events. The Conservancy is blessed with incredible corporate support, and tonight we want to recognize Brook Hills Investment Group for making educational programming about Shanks Ferry Wildflower Preserve and the native plants it protects possible. We also want to thank our generous annual sponsors, who include the Wenger Group, Clark Associates, Nimblist, Electron Energy Corporation, Eurofins, J Group, Dart Container, Prana, Armstrong, Commonwealth Financial Associates, PP&L, Cargus, and Penstone. And now I would like to introduce tonight's Nature Hour, Spring Ephemeral Wildflowers with Keith Williams. Keith is a naturalist educator, writer, and photographer. He has a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Biology from Kutztown University and a Master's of Science in Ecological Teaching and Learning from the Lesley University Audubon Expedition Institute. He has been taking people into backcountry settings for 30 years and has established outdoor education programs across the U.S., in China, and Puerto Rico. His first book, Snorkelhead: Adventures in River Snorkeling, was published in 2016, and his second river snorkeling book, Snorkeling Rivers and Streams, An Aquatic Guide to Underwater Discovery and Adventure, was published by Stackpole Books in March of 2020. Keith is currently the Vice President for Engagement and Education at the Lancaster Conservancy, where he serves as the Conservancy's lead naturalist, develops programs, and manages volunteers, and manages the Interpretive Ranger Program. He is a nationally registered paramedic, wilderness emergency medical technician, wilderness medicine instructor, swiftwater rescue technician, and wildlands firefighter. Without further ado, thank you, Keith Williams.
Thanks, Kelly. Share my screen real quick. All right, everybody see that okay? So thanks for joining us tonight, everybody. And I have it on really, really good authority that in a little bit more than a month, parts of our forests are going to start look like this instead of the frozen, I don't say wasteland. They're pretty amazing this time of year too, but the frozenness that they are right now. So what's not super obvious in our woods today, in our wintertime forests, is all the energy that's stored just beneath the surface, beneath the snow and the frozen soil. And all that energy is in the roots and the bulbs and the corms of our spring ephemeral wildflowers. And it seems to change from a scene like this to this in a blink of an eye. After waiting out the really long, cold months, the spring ephemerals just bring so much hope and joy. And they just fill our forests with this burst of beauty. And sometimes it seems like it's a burst of beauty for beauty's sake, but it's actually the culmination of a really genius strategy that capitalizes on the limiting factor in our forests. And that limiting factor is sunlight, right? When all that sunlight hits the forest floor is when it's not the growing season, it's too cold. And then as soon as things warm up enough and the plants, the trees specifically, start to send fluid from the roots into the aerial parts and they start to bud out, there's a short window of time when that sunlight is actually hitting the forest floor. And these spring ephemerals take advantage of that. So here in the ancestral lands of the Susquehannock and the Shanks Ferry and the Conestoga peoples, we're blessed with this amazing rush of energy and color that just seems to burst from the ground. And we call them ephemeral because from our perspective, they last for about a month. Again, limited by the limiting factor of sunlight reaching the forest floor. But from an ecological perspective, they're long-lived beings, and they've developed this incredible strategy to sprout and grow and reproduce and make and store sugars and carbohydrates in the roots in the short interval between when the soil warms up enough for them to start metabolizing and the canopy leafs out, which eliminates most of the sunlight from hitting the forest floor. And in my opinion, my bias, right? I've been in this landscape for over 30 years, so take that for what it's worth. But my bias, it's one of the most breathtaking spectacles in the world. And their early strategy supports a reawakening or a revving up of the springtime ecology and supporting early emerging insects like this comma, this eastern-tailed blue, and this bumblebee. And it seems like the beauty of these flowers just kind of transfers up the food chain, just like the food that they produce. And they fill the forest with this intense color and beauty, and we're drawn to beauty. In fact, Irish poet and philosopher John O'Donoghue feels that we need beauty because it gives us all these things: a sense of homecoming, a sense of aliveness, a sense of completion, regeneration, awakening, compassion, a sense of the invisible world, and a sense of the earth. And certainly when I'm out at Shanks Ferry in wildflower season, there's no question I get all of these things and then some just from being in the presence of all this incredible beauty from these wildflowers. And so we're drawn to this, right? We need beauty as humans. It's a need, it's a human need. And so a lot of times what we do is we tend to single out individual beautiful subjects like this trillium from the amazing whole. But what I submit is there's even more beauty when we acknowledge the complex reciprocal and interdependent relationships between all beings. And so I hope to explore that tonight, starting with Virginia bluebells. These are one of the most prominent, often the harbinger of this profusion of color, are Virginia bluebells. We'll start getting phone calls probably in the next week or so about, hey, what's blooming at Shanks Ferry? When's the peak? When's the peak? And what people a lot of times are asking is the peak is when the bluebells are in full bloom. And they've got this really cool strategy where the buds get darker the older the unpollinated blossom goes. It intensifies to attract pollinators. So remember that this is a race to reproduce, all in a very, very short time. So the flowers do everything they can to ensure pollination, like intensifying the colors of the unpollinated blossoms, so that a pollinator like a bee will come and visit. And in exchange for all that work, they provide nectar to the bees and other pollinators. We'll explore pollination a little bit more as we go along tonight. So that's the first example of a reciprocal relationship, right? This idea of reciprocity is it's not extractive. It's not just one being taking from the other. It's an exchange between two beings. And so they fill the forest with color, and then we start to see other plants kind of coming in, like this trillium, this nodding trillium. It's a really beautiful, creamy white blossom, as opposed to this one, which is all red, right? And this one's called the stinking Benjamin, or Trillium erectum. And it's pollinated by flies, right? So we really need to rethink our concept of pollination. We'll talk a bit more about this later. And then we've got this third trillium, Trillium flexipes, or Susquehanna trillium. We're really not sure what's up with Susquehanna trillium. We're not sure if it's a cross between stinking Benjamin or nodding trillium, or if it's its own species. Right now, it's considered its own species, Trillium flexipes, and not a hybrid between stinking Benjamin and the nodding. But either way, sorry, you stink. All right. So it's a really cool strategy that some plants have developed for pollination. So from our perspective, our bias, a lot of times when we think of pollination, we think of these really pretty brightly colored flowers and these really fragrant perfumes that they emit to attract the pollinators in. But there's this whole other group of plants that use a very different tactic, and that's to spell nasty and to look like rotting flesh, which is what this stinking Benjamin does, right? So it's nasty from our perspective, but if you're a fly, man, these stinking Benjamins are the bomb. And there's other plants that follow that same kind of strategy. And unfortunately, skunk cabbage is often eliminated from consideration when you're talking about spring ephemerals. But these are the first flowers that are up. In fact, we've had them here for about 2 weeks at Climbers Run. It's another amazing plant. They've got the ability, these cabbage hoods or the spays, produce heat to melt snow. And that white around that skunk cabbage hood is exactly that. That was from, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. I got this picture at Climbers where those skunk cabbage hoods or the spays were producing heat. So these start the process really, really early on. About mid-February is when we first start seeing the skunk cabbage hoods start to emerge. And so inside that spathe is the spadix, right? That's the flower. And it's this tiny, it's this kind of alien looking ball sphere that's covered in these tiny little yellow flowers that are pollinated by flies, right? So all that to say is our pollination systems are native for starters, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that, about the European honeybee. But more pollination happens with native pollinators. Nothing against the European honeybee necessarily. But we got to give credit to the native pollinators too. And it's not all about really brightly colored flowers and pretty smells. Sometimes it's the opposite, to attract things that might be attracted to decomposing flesh to do the work of the pollination. And then, besides this really cool system of or ability to melt snow and ice and be the first ones up to get a jump on pollination, later in the season, these skunk cabbages produce these huge, beautiful, lush green leaves that just blanket wet areas. Right, this is really a wetland plant. You can typically tell where the wetlands are early in the spring by looking for the big green clumps. Another really cool plant that has a little yellow flower on it is called the blue cohosh. We think cohosh comes from Algonquin, meaning rough. And one of the cool things about this plant is when it first emerges, it comes up out of the ground looking like this crowfoot claw kind of thing, and then it just kind of unfurls into this really beautiful, dainty little yellow flower that has like this almost this slate blue tint to it, and then over time it emerges into a regular yellow flower. But the cool thing about this is there's actually nectar glands on the leaves, right? So again, plants have evolved ways to attract pollinators, and blue cohosh actually use glands on the leaf to produce nectar rather than the flower, and that brings the pollinator in. And they still go ahead and put energy into creating the flower anyway. And there's other smaller yellow flowers in our palette of spring ephemerals, like this one, the trout lily. That's actually named for brook trout. So if you look at the leaves in this picture, you see the modeling on that, and that resembles the modeling that you see on the side of a brook trout, the only native trout that we have here in the East. Another really interesting plant. They need to be 7 years old before they produce the first flower, right? So flowering is sexual maturity. So this plant needs to be 7 years old before it's sexually mature. And that alone right there kind of takes the concept of our concept of ephemerality and kind of tosses it out the window. And then the other piece of this is only 1/3 of the lily colony will produce flowers in a given year, right? So these trout lilies can produce really large lilies. In fact, last year when I was hiking out to Cuffs Run, it was the biggest lily colony I'd ever seen. It was probably every bit of a half an acre, just incredible. And those colonies can be 200 to 300 years old, right? So that not the individuals in that colony, but the colony itself can be going on for 200 to 300 years. And again, 7 years before an individual lily produces a flower, becomes sexually mature. Takes the whole concept of ephemerality and tosses it out, at least our version of that concept of ephemerality, and tosses it out. And they're pollinated by an assortment of native pollinators, right? And so again, we typically think of bees and more specifically European honeybee as the pollinating machines, and that's really just not the case. That task is shared by a wide variety of organisms, like this this digger bee, and beetles get into the act, right? Here, this is a longhorn beetle that is a pollinator. And then another really cool early season wildflower, one of the first ones up, are these Dutchman's breeches. right? They're named for the shape of the flower and the deeply toothed leaf. So if you look at the scientific name, Dicentra, the genus, that's named because of the deeply divided leaves. Dicentra is the leafly divided leaves. And the common name is Dutchman's breeches. It's this V that look like pants hanging from a clothesline to dry. And so that's where that plant gets its name. And so, what's not obvious in this picture, besides all of the energy that's stored beneath the surface in corms and tubers and roots of our spring ephemerals, are queen bumblebees, right? So the queen bumblebee was mated in the fall. She's the only one to survive her colony, and she finds a place to overwinter just beneath the surface in the soil, often beneath fallen leaves. So something that each one of us can do that would go a long way to help restore ecosystem function and protect biodiversity is simply leave the leaves in our yards. Queen bumblebees and so many other kinds of insects just simply need that leaf matter to estivate through the wintertime to complete their life cycle. So something really simple. So anyway, this queen is essentially hibernating for the winter just beneath the surface of the soil, beneath fallen leaves. She's the only one that survived her colony from the year before, and she's mated, right? So she's got fertilized eggs on board. And the queen bumble emergence timing is perfectly timed with when the Dutchman's breeches are in bloom. And she's starving, right? She just spent the winter hibernating. And so she needs nectar and she needs pollen immediately for her survival, but then also to provision her colony, because she's going to form the next small social colony with, maybe, up to maybe 100 individuals, if that many, in her colony. And that thing out front is not her sting, right? They do have a stinger that comes out of the posterior and the back. That's her tongue. And that's important because she needs to be a long-tongued animal to get the nectar out of the flower. This reciprocal relationship's been developed over 33 million years. And those Dutchman's breeches aren't going to give up their nectar without getting anything in return. So the bee's got to work for it. And one of the ways that Dutchman's breeches ensures that bee is going to get pollen on her is by putting that nectar deep into the blossom. So that long tongue is an adaptation to getting the nectar out of that long tube of a flower. Bumblebees are in trouble. They're declining rapidly. We're learning that they have to go up in elevation or in altitude to survive. We think this might be a climate-related elimination of bee numbers, of bumblebee numbers. One of the things that we're worried about here is a derangement of bloom time and emergence time. So the bumblebee's emergence time is really dictated by soil temperature, whereas the bloom time of the Dicentra, of the Dutchman's breeches, is more dictated by daylight length and sunlight. And so if the bee is emerging either too early or too late because of differences in temperature, because of climate destabilization, and it's not timed with when those blossoms are at peak, she's got to find another nectar source or she's not going to make it. And so sometimes these finely tuned reciprocal relationships are a little bit too finely tuned, and it results in the potential loss of one of the partners in the relationship. But it's really cool to watch this play out before our eyes every spring because it's still going on. It's one of these things where I've got a lot of hope in this work, and we'll hear more about that later, but I'm pretty cautious about it too. And every time I see a bumblebee on Dutchman's breeches, I spend a lot of time watching because that might go away in my lifetime. I want to be able to remember what it was like so I could communicate that to my next generations. Sometimes these Dutchman's breeches are confused with another Dicentra, this one, squirrel corn. So squirrel corn is named for its little bulbs that look like corn, which apparently squirrels go crazy for. I've never seen that in person, but I'm assuming with the name of squirrel corn, there's a relationship between squirrels and this plant. But the flowers on this are more heart-shaped than in the Dutchman's breeches. And this is another one named for its roots, toothwort. It came from the rootstock that if you were to dig this up, which we highly discourage, we'll talk about plant theft in a little while. But if you were to dig this up and try to transplant it to your house, it's probably not going to survive. It's pretty specific to the soil requirements. But if you were to dig that plant up and look at the rootstock, it would look like teeth, right? Look like dentition. So toothwort comes from what its roots look like. And all the plants we've discussed so far depend on ants to disperse their seeds. So this is another extremely ingenious strategy that plants have developed. All right, the plant attaches a little packet of sugar or fat to the seed called a lysosome, and ants carry that with that lysosome with the seed attached back to their colony. And they eat the sugar or the fat packet off of there, and they leave the seed either in their colony or they throw it out in their trash pile, which happens to be really, really well aerated, highly fertile patch of soil. So the seed just got planted by ants after they're done eating the lysosome to facilitate seed dispersal. So think about the strategies that these plants have developed to take advantage of the limiting factor of sunlight by rushing their life history, right? And then they develop really complicated pollinator relationships to ensure that they get pollinated in the right way, at the right time, by the right organism. And then they attach sugar or fat to their seeds to ensure that they get planted in the most fertile soil in the forest. Columbine likes rockier environments, and so we typically find it growing on the rock outcrops at Shanks Ferry. And it's the host plant to the Columbine dusky wing. It's a kind of a skipper that's critically imperiled in Pennsylvania. This used to be a really, really common animal throughout the eastern U.S., and it's entirely dependent on Columbine. So part of the reason that this animal is going away is because Columbine is on the decline. Another plant that likes rocky outcrops is early saxifrage. There's the early saxifrage is the plant in the upper left corner of this photo. And the second plant with the pink striations on it is spring beauties. They're pollinated by digger bees or andrena bees. And take a look at the pollen sacs, right? Bees have these specialized structures called pollen baskets, and you can see it on the hind legs there, where all that pink pollen from the spring beauties just looks like it's been accumulated by that bee. It looks like cotton candy. And there's another beetle, right? So again, another example of multiple pollinators in this incredible system of pollination that's evolved over millions of years. And there's a ground beetle also pollinating the spring beauties. A little bit later in the season, we start seeing these umbrella things coming up. And these are really alien-looking plants. They're pretty cool, called May apples. And they get this blossom on them that kind of looks like the mouth of the plant in Little Shop of Horrors, right? The one was a Feed Me, Henry. I think whoever wrote that was inspired by the blossom that you see right there in the crook of that May apple. And those will progress to become these really big, good almost inch diameter across white blossoms with yellow centers. Other plants that are a little bit later in the season is the jack in the pulpit. So we'll start seeing these come up in mid to late May, and they'll stay in the forest through the summertime. And the pulpit is the spathe, right? The hood, and then inside is the spadix, the flowering part. That's jack. Another one is golden ragwort. And we also see woodland phlox. And so woodland phlox blooms after most of our other spring wildflowers are done, and they continue the color palette into late spring. And on the other end of the blooming timeline, one of our earliest bloomers is bloodroot, named for the corms that seem to bleed when they're cut. And interestingly, this plant doesn't produce nectar. Like you look at that beautiful white flower with the yellow throat, and I'm thinking, boy, that's loaded with nectar, right? Well, they do that as subterfuge. That's all fake. It's like, hey, look at all the nectar over here, and the insect shows up and it comes away with no nectar, because making nectar is energetically expensive, right? It costs a lot in terms of metabolism. So if you can get away with getting pollinated without having to produce any nectar, that's a win. But if you look at this bloodroot and you see who's on it, these are little midges. They're a kind of a fly, an aquatic midge, in fact. So it makes a lot of sense. These particular bloodroot patches right along the Climbers Run stream at our Climbers Run Preserve. And that's a little bit of a look-alike to this, right? This is Star of Bethlehem, which is a significant problem on some of our preserves. This is a non-native, and it's taken over parts of the floodplain at Climbers Run. And last year was the first season that we tried to control for it, and we're figuring out the strategy that we're going to use to this season, to try to control for it. And it produces a ton of pollen. And so if you look at this halictid bee or a metallic sweat bee, it's loaded with pollen. And so you would think that that's a great thing. Look at that one coming out of there, right? It's like, wow, what a party that was. But not all pollen and not all nectar is created equal, right? We learned that lesson. I learned that lesson the really hard way when I had butterfly bush planted in my yard. Now, butterfly bush is this shrub, right? Not butterfly weed. Butterfly weed is this, medium-sized perennial plant that has this beautiful orange blossom. It's kind of a milkweed. That's a native. That's really good. Butterfly bush is a shrub that's not from here. It produces these typically yellow or white, like cascading blooms, and the butterflies go crazy for this stuff. But nutritionally, it's hollow. So not all nectar is created equal, and just because a particular organism or pollinator is going after a particular blossom doesn't necessarily mean it's good for them. I mean, look at how many of us go to McDonald's, right? An entomologist friend of mine said a butterfly eating nectar from a butterfly weed, I'm sorry, a butterfly bush, is the equivalent of us eating every meal at McDonald's in terms of health. Another one of my friends said it's more like crack cocaine at every meal. It's that detrimental. And then we have speedwells, these little blue flowers that's being pollinated by hoverflies. So there's another kind of a pollinator, right? Hoverflies do a great job pollinating a lot of native stuff in addition to the speedwells. And then Scylla is another non-native. We have a little patch of this at Shanks. Beautiful flower, this little blue flower. One of these plants that's just kind of a heartbreaker when I learned that it wasn't native to here. And this one's a real threat. So you see the dicentra right in the middle there, right? You see the Dutchman's breeches, those white V's with the deeply toothed leaves, and then right off to the right and the left, you see these yellow blossoms with the kind of the heart-shaped waxy leaves. That's lesser celandine. And lesser celandine is a very aggressive perennial, and it'll turn an area into a complete monoculture, right? And it's a prolific seeder, and it has these tiny little gravel-sized bulbs that are almost impossible to dig out and dig them all out. So this is a real problem, and the problem comes in because it eliminates native diversity, like violets. And the lack of that native diversity then translates to a lack of this kind of beauty, right? This is a regal fritillary, and their caterpillars are obligate to violets, a specific kind of violet. But the idea is that caterpillar for this beautiful butterfly can only live on a violet. And if you've got lesser celandine taken over and those violets aren't there, then there's no food for the babies of this beauty. And these are only found in one place in Pennsylvania right now, Fort Indian Town Gap, that's doing an amazing job of managing a population of about 1,000 individuals. This organism used to be here in Lancaster County, used to be here in York, used to be relatively common throughout the eastern US, and it's declining throughout its entire range to the point where it's only found in one place in Pennsylvania. Again, Fort Indian Town Gap, and the Department of the Army and National Guard is doing a great job managing for these beauties. And they're not alone, right? I mean, we're seeing a loss of diversity here. Insects are what we're losing right now. About 20 species of insect that used to occur in Lancaster and York aren't here anymore, including the regal fritillary. That bumblebee up on the top is the rusty patch bumblebee. The middle one is the American bumblebee, Bombus pennsylvanicus. And that beauty on the bottom right is a frosted elfin. And that's consistent with what we're seeing globally, right? So that orange line labeled Lepidoptera shows about a 30% decline in abundance of lepidopterids, moths and butterflies. And that red line are all the other invertebrates, all the other insects. And that's about a 75% reduction in their abundance. And the reasons for that are primarily habitat loss, right? Development obviously eliminates their habitat. And it's also being driven by this, right? Invasives, garlic mustard. All those little white blossoms are the blossoms of garlic mustard. And this is kind of cool in an evil way. Garlic mustard, like a lot of mustards, actually emit a fungicide through the roots. And so there's chemical warfare that goes on at the plant level quite a bit. There are a number of plants that emit allelopathic compounds, or basically herbicides, that kill off the competition. What garlic mustard does is it emits a fungicide to kill off vesicular arbuscular mycorrhizae, basically fungi that wrap around the roots of of different plants. And that's one of the ways that plants are able to transfer nutrients from the soil into their tissues, is through that vesicular or buscular mycorrhizae. And they're not nearly as effective at doing that without that VAM. And so garlic mustard essentially kills off its competition. And if that competition happens to be native plants, the beauty of Shanks Ferry, then that becomes a monoculture of garlic. There are other threats to the Shanks Ferry Preserve and to the plants that live there. You know, we've got it protected from development, but that doesn't mean it's safe necessarily. And one of those threats are photographers, right? I'm one of them. And the number of times I've been so tempted just to take 2 steps off the trail, just 2 steps, just to get closer to that trillium or that putty root orchid. But my 2 steps multiplied by 300 or 400 visitors a day becomes very, very damaging to those plants. Dogs off lead do incredible harm to spring ephemerals. They get trampled, they get dug up, and in addition to just taking away from the experience of other preserve users, besides being unsafe for the dog itself. So dogs are typically allowed on our preserves, but please keep them on lead. Then we got plant theft. We've got people that actually go to Shanks Ferry and steal plants to plant in their yards. It's very inspiring to know that native landscaping is really taken off to the point where you can't find native plants in nurseries. And so people go to our preserves sometimes and they dig them up to take them home. If they do that, they're not going to survive. Right? Those plants are pretty specific to Shanks Ferry. And, taking them from that kind of microclimate and soil type and plunking them down in a typical suburban yard is likely not going to be successful. And we just killed some stuff. And we've actually lost a couple of species from Shanks due to plant theft. There is an inspiring story related to this, though. I was at Shanks digging up celandine. And if you know Shanks, there's a railroad that goes right along the access road right there. And I'm in view of that railroad. And there's a service road along that rail line that's for railroad use only. It's trespassing. I think it's a federal offense, in fact, if you drive along that. But locally, it's called the drunk highway because you can drive from Shanks Ferry down to Peckway and essentially evade law enforcement. So if you happen to be somewhere and have too much to drink, not that I'm condoning this, I think it's a really stupid idea because you're driving along an active rail line. Anyway, you got this drunk highway, right? And I'm out there in the middle of the day, in the middle of the week, digging up celandine, and I see this old junky pickup truck rattling down the drunk highway, and they stop and they open their door, and I'm waiting for it. I'm waiting. And this guy hops out and says, "Hey, quit stealing them plants." So I was like, "Hey, man, thanks for looking out for the place." Kind of restored my faith in humanity. But anyway, any one of those things happens, right? A photographer takes 2 steps off trail or 1 step off trail. Somebody picks a flower innocently enough, right? Or maybe not so innocently, digs them up, or a dog is running off lead. Any one of those things. All it takes is one of those missteps to kill a plant that takes 7 years to reproduce. And we run the risk of losing a colony that might be 200 to 300 years old. And again, those things are threats, right? Dogs off lead, stealing plants, walking off trail, picking them. But these are the drivers to regional biodiversity loss and global biodiversity loss, development and habitat degradation due to invasives. These threats result in these trends: that 30% reduction in moths and butterflies, 75% reduction in all other invertebrates, which obviously is going to translate up the food chain, right? We're seeing those reductions in birds, 60% reduction in bird biomass in North America over the last 40 years. What do baby birds eat? Caterpillars. They don't eat birdseed. They're eating soft-bodied insects. So if we're losing those soft-bodied insects, like the lepidopterans, like the moths and butterflies, we're going to lose the birds. So it makes sense that it all translates. The good news is we're a solution for that, right? We are a solution to both of these driving threats, to the beauty and the biodiversity of this amazing region. We've got 10,000 acres protected on 50 preserves. We just added another 54 in our 51st preserve. So we just added 54 more acres in our 51st preserve in York County. That was just announced yesterday, I believe. And so we're a solution to habitat loss. We are actively out there protecting land. And we're actively out there managing that land. So this is a crew of volunteers at Shanks Ferry last year. We removed 6,000 gallons of garlic from our preserves in last year alone. And we stand, I don't want to jinx us, but we stand to double that volume this year, given the number of volunteers that we've got coming out so far. And so a site that looked like this now looks like this. And together we can take this trend and reverse it. And we can make sure that this beauty and this diversity remains part of our landscape. And with your help, we can keep it wild. So thanks for tuning in tonight. Does anybody have any questions? Let me stop sharing so I can see our question and answers. So if you have any questions at all, just pop them into the Q&A down at the bottom. So we've got, Shanks Ferry is our most well-known preserve for wildflowers, for spring ephemeral wildflowers. But there's another one, Ferncliff, that is equally showy for wildflowers. And there's a couple others. Shiprock is another good one. And keep tabs on our website and on our social medias, our social media outlets, because we'll start giving updates on what's blooming where as soon as we start getting our first our first flowers. We got one question. Once the invasives are removed, is the native seed bank still there? It usually is, which is really great. So our tactic on especially on those herbaceous invasives are we pull them up and we don't do anything beyond that. And typically that native seed bank is still there and it takes over. We just have to give those natives a little bit of space and less competition for sunlight, water, and nutrition. So there was a question on the map that we showed about the dotted lines on the map of the Conservancy lands. One went from Lidditz south. I'm pretty sure that dotted line is the Conestoga Trail. So the Conestoga Trail is a long distance trail that goes from the southwestern part of the county up along the river, traverses across the county, and ends in the northeastern part. So I'm pretty sure that dotted line that was on that map was showing the Conestoga. It intersects a number of our preserves, which are kind of like pearls on a necklace. Another question is, can you pull garlic or mustard? Do you have to dig the root? No, you can pull it. That's one of the beauties of garlic is it pulls right out without having to dig. And but we've learned that you really have to pull it out. We've tried string trimming it. We've tried which the flowers grow right back. And so garlic mustard is a biennial. So if we kill it before it produces seed, we're essentially stopping that next generation. But once it starts producing seed, it's too late. So we try to get it before it blossoms. And we've learned that if you go and string trim it, which is a lot of a faster approach, it sends shoots back up again and flowers again. So we really have to pull it up and bag it up and remove it. So that's the tactic that we typically use. Another question about the best time to visit Shanks to avoid the crowds. Stay away from the weekends for sure. If you can do weekdays, that would be great. Peak blooming is typically centered right on Easter. So, about a month before up to a month after is when the wildflowers are in bloom. There's about a 3 or 4 week window when it's really, really hot, typically centered right on Easter, but weekdays are definitely the best time to visit to avoid the crowds. So another question about these plants are thought of as being shade, but they actually need sun to flower. Yeah, that's exactly right. Now they're adapted to be able to live in a shady environment for, 10, 11 months out of the year. But they need that sunlight for all the energy that it takes to reproduce and to store carbohydrates and sugars in their roots that last them through the rest of the year. How can you tell what nectar is non-nutritious? It's a matter of getting into the scientific literature. As far as I know, there's no way to kind of look at a plant and determine if that's going to be nutritious or not. General rule of thumb is if it's not from here, it's probably not good for the insects that live here. Again, those relationships have evolved over millions of years. They've grown up together. They've co-evolved. And so if there's a bunch of plants that are in the ecosystem that aren't native to here, the insects that are here aren't used to using that nectar. And so it's probably not going to be as good for them as the native stuff. We talked about Cuffs Run. That's not actually a preserve. Cuffs Run is a beautiful piece of the York landscape. It's a stream that flows through, it's named after a stream called Cuffs Run, and it's the site of a proposed hydroelectric project that the Conservancy and a number of other nonprofit partners are fighting. So asking about when you're on preserved trails, is it okay to pull the garlic mustard? Yes, as long as you are 100% confident in the ID and that you can take it with you. Because we've also learned that if you pull it and you throw it on the trail, there's still a chance that it's going to keep on growing and produce viable seed. Parking at Ferncliff is tight. We are working on expanding that parking so it'll accommodate about a half a dozen cars when it's finally done. We are not directly working with nurseries to stop selling invasives. So that's a little bit beyond our mission. Again, our mission is really focused on protecting and restoring land. But we do have a community wildlife habitat program that has resources for homeowners to use in terms of reputable nurseries that we know are growing native varieties of wildflowers and aren't using neonicotinoid insecticides, which are also very damaging. Shanks Ferry does have a couple of different species of orchids, namely putty root, but Welsh Mountain is the orchid capital in terms of our preserves. Indian cucumber, world begonia, and a lot of pink lady slippers. The specific ephemerals that would work well in a suburban garden really depend on the conditions of that suburban garden. I've seen bluebells do really great in that setting. I've seen some dicentras do well. I've seen columbine do well, but it really depends on how much sun that site is getting, how wet it is, soil conditions, and things like that. Another question about deer. Yeah, deer are a huge problem, not only overbrowsing wildflowers, but just about any other native plant. So if you look at the complexion of our plant community, it is dictated largely by deer. Whatever the deer don't eat are really abundant. That's why we have such a huge abundance of spice bush, which again is a native shrub. It gets this really cool, pretty yellow blossom on it, but it's way over abundant because that's what deer don't eat. So what can you do to foster insect habitats without being too invasive? I would really briefly, things like leaving the leaves, things like, planting natives wherever you can, understanding that there are certain rules that you might have to follow, some codes in the township or in the municipality where you work or the HOA where you live, or I'm sorry, where you live or the HOA where you live. But even if you could just like rake the leaves into one corner of your property, goes a long way. But definitely check out our webpage under Community Wildlife Habitat, and that's got some really good resources that give you a little bit more detail and concrete answers. There's also classes that we offer in native habitats that you can take. Welsh Mountain is best to go to in like the first week of May. That's when it seems to be at peak color, right? So right when Shanks Ferry is wrapping up with its peak color, Welsh Mountain is revving up with the orchids that I mentioned earlier, in addition to azaleas and mountain laurel. And I think Kelly or Avery just posted places to check out wildflowers besides Shanks Ferry. Another question about garlic mustard. Garlic mustard is in fact edible. It makes a wonderful pesto. You want to try to use the earlier, younger leaves, though. I heard it was selling for $9 a pound in New York City last year, but I'm not sure if that's true or not. I shouldn't spread rumors, right? There's information in the Q&A about Cuffs Run and our fight to protect that beautiful place along with other partners. I think that's everything. Well, thanks once again, everybody, for coming out tonight. This is the last of our Nature Hour series for the season. So we've gone through another winter, and this one was a real one, finally. Although I'm happy to be done with temperatures in the teens, and really looking forward to seeing these beautiful spring ephemerals come up. So check out our website. It's got all of our events on it. The events coming up are really focused on celebrating those beautiful spring ephemerals. We got a number of interpretive hikes that are going to be at Shanks Ferry. We've got a number of volunteer events. If you're interested in joining us in that fight on a regular basis, we've got this amazing community of volunteers that we call our volunteer land stewards. That's growing. You can come out and assist with them. Come out just for one volunteer event. Everything counts. And check out our website for other ways that you can engage with us to help us protect and restore the beautiful place where we live. And thanks again, everybody. Appreciate you coming out.